RKO is one of my favorite studios because of technical level of expertise the various departments had. Visual effects, they had one of the best departments in the industry. Vernon Walker was the head of the visual effects department at RKO. His specialty was rear projection, and then Linwood Dunn on the optical printer. And another important collaboration in making Citizen Kane was working with Greg Tolan, a very accomplished cinematographer. I consider Citizen Kane a visual effects picture. Linwood Dunn told me that more than 50% of the picture has opticals or composites or matte paintings or transitions of some kind. So that is a lot of work. And again, unusual for the time to have so much additional visual effects work in your picture.
Citizen Kane is, of course, a movie which has imagery and sound to tell a story. But I'd wager that if you turn the bulb off in the projector or turned off the display in your room and listened to this movie, that you would be able to not only follow the story in great part, but also ride the emotional ups and downs of the story and understand what's going on. I really think that you could argue that Citizen Kane is a radio play with picture added.
Orson Welles was offered this incredible opportunity from RKO to come and make a movie in Hollywood. He had just completed his War of the Worlds telecast, where he took the form of a radio drama and changed it to make it simulate a live news show. So people would be interrupting and breaking in for news flashes, explaining how the aliens were attacking New Jersey. And the whole thing was done like it was seriously happening. It created panic and an upheaval. Everyone got very upset, and it made Welles's name a household name and gave him some notoriety so that he was then ultimately offered this amazing deal to come and make a film where he would have final cut.
Orson Welles was a proven genius in radio. So when he comes to RKO, he brings with him this tremendous inventory of creativity with sound. In radio, one has to create a place, create distinctive characters, manufacture transitions so the audience can follow the story. And Welles brings an inventory of ideas and experience to each one of those areas and brings it into the motion picture realm. Rosebud. Welles made particular use of dynamic range. That is, you go from soft to loud and loud to soft. It's something that gives the filmmaker room to go up and down and you make the audience kind of lean into their radio or their movie listening, and then you shock them with something big.
News on the march!
There's an interesting choice that Welles made at the very beginning of Citizen Kane. After you hear the RKO Morse code, logo, and all your expectations are that a big main title music is going to come crashing in because that's what Hollywood movies did then. But it doesn't. Suddenly it's absolutely silent and the word Citizen Kane pops on the screen. And it almost has a sound to it because it's so shocking. You don't expect it. You expected a crash of music, and it's just a big visual. It pops in. It's a great use of dynamic range.
Reading about Welles and his experience of coming to Hollywood and making a picture, he equated the idea of movie making to building a house. A house would have to have a foundation. It would have to have different departments come in to add the plumbing, the electricity, the walls, and ultimately the roof. But he said that the effort would be useless if it wasn't also haunted, that there wasn't something inside that was more than the sum of its parts. And that is what he set out to do with Kane, and ultimately what he was successful at producing one of the finest motion pictures ever made.
What was she like?
She's like all the girls I knew in dancing school. Very nice girl, very nice. Emily was a little nicer. Well, after the first couple of months, she and Charlie didn't see much of each other except at breakfast.
He wanted to change the form of storytelling. If you compare Citizen Kane to some of the other movies of its time, movies like How Green Was My Valley or The Maltese Falcon, these are all great movies, no doubt about it, but they're very traditional in their approach to storytelling. Wells wanted to do something different with Citizen Kane. He wanted to break the normal routine of a narrative and find a way to tell a story in a different way. Greg Toland worked with some of the best directors in Hollywood, like John Ford, and the idea that he would want to work with Wells, who had no experience, at first you would think, why would somebody at the top of his form want to work with an amateur? And the reason why is because he understood the idea of working with somebody that would bring something new to the experience, someone who's perhaps open to different ideas or breaking those conventions. And so their collaboration was extremely important. And the idea of this style of filmmaking, which was really developed in Citizen Kane, they were more interested in creating a scene of an ensemble cast where the characters would speak their lines and the audience would choose to look at a character as they were speaking, more than cutting to close-ups, which would be the conventional way to approach a scene like that. And in order to do that, Toland had this idea of what he called pan focus, which was his technique of stopping the lens down so that the depth of field of the scene would increase. And so if the entire room is in focus, you can then have the actors staged and play the scene with the audience deciding who they wanted to look at any given moment. In order to make that work, the technology had to be there. Lighting instruments were getting better. The other thing was he had a faster film stock. And so if you photograph a scene with, say, a 24 millimeter lens at f8, f11, we have what's called the hyperfocal distance, which is when you set the lens at a certain setting, it allows everything to be in focus half the distance from the subject out to infinity. And so ultimately, Wells could stage his scenes more as an ensemble cast, perhaps in the way that his Mercury Theater might do a radio play around a microphone, allowing all the characters to work together, because that's what they were used to. That's how they worked in radio and in the theater. And he wanted to find the way to bring his way of working into the cinematic world. There's a scene in the film with Susan Alexander who has overdosed her sedative, and there's a glass with a spoon on a table in the foreground, and the medicine bottle, and Susan is in bed. The way that they did this is by lighting the set in two different ways. They first keep the foreground dark when Orson Welles opens the doorway, and then they rewind the film in the camera, and they illuminate the glass and the medicine bottle in the foreground, exposing it with a new exposure into that black area that was reserved for it. And so the combination of the two creates this incredible deep focus shot with the spoon and the glass in sharp focus in the extreme foreground, and Kane and the doorway all the way into the distance, all completely in sharp focus. Creating this illusion takes time on the set. You have to set up the foreground and the background. You have to take the film out of the camera and rewind it in the dark, reload the camera. Linwood Dunn was on the set and he observed this, and he sort of said, well, gee, that's kind of taking a lot of time. It might be better to do those kinds of shots on the optical printer as a composite. Once Wells figured out how the optical printer could work, then there was a whole new aspect of achievement that happened on Citizen Kane, changing existing shots and enhancing them in a post-production process.
The scene has some very interesting usage of sound. You start out with cutting to her, and you're hearing just her sick breathing. It's not really clear in the frame. I mean, she's there, she's a little soft out of focus in a shadow. You understand right away that this is not healthy. And there's this furious knocking in the background. It's very much a radio scene, and you have the sound structured around the look of the shot. You've got distant sound, the door being open, and you got the close-up and quieter, softer sound of Susan breathing. Once again, it's using soft and loud sounds together in a very effective way. It's great stuff.
For the Madison Square Garden sequence, it starts off with a matte painting. And the matte painter paints the scene and expands the scope of the shot. Additionally, the matte painters came up with a little idea of adding animation to the edges of the painted audience. So they would have little highlights on the shoulders or on the hair to give it a little bit more life and movement. So the live action then is only this little bit of stage construction of Wells performing on a stage. That's combined with the painting to create a new scene. Then the camera pushes in, and as we get closer to the stage, we cross-dissolve to the set, and then the camera is shooting the sequence on the available set.
Hope of being elected. Now, however, I have something more than a hope.
There's also, in addition to matte paintings, miniatures that are created for Citizen Kane. One of the famous ones is the flying over the nightclub and through the sign and then down into the window. The beginning of the shot is that the camera moves toward the sign. As you flew through the sign had to break away to make room for the camera. So if you look really closely, you can kind of see where the sign is going to break away. And then ultimately, it marries up again through the optical printer to other footage of the set going into the actual nightclub. Again, this idea of the floating narrative that's in this movie where, you know, the camera is sort of free to explore and to find things. And that was a really innovative moment to sort of have that idea as part of your storytelling process.
When we go to Susan's nightclub, and it's a very sudden transition visually, the role of sound there not only is to provide a little shock, but sound binds things together to take separate imagery, which wasn't filmed at the same time, cut them together. Sound is a way of binding them all together into a whole. Having come from radio, Wells also was adept at using reverberation on voices to give a scene depth so that the audience listening senses the perspective of where the characters are in the scene. Treating sound in a motion picture with this kind of depth was not often done. It was not the style of the Hollywood pictures of the day. But Wells uses it so effectively. For example, in the Thatcher Library scene,
Of the conditions under which you may inspect certain portions of Mr. Thatcher's unpublished memoirs. Yes, Jennings.
all the voices are treated with very heavy reverb so that you get the impression this is a stone mausoleum sort of thing. It's this cold, isolating place. And the voices are swallowed up by the room, which adds reverberation to it.
Linwood Dunn came up with a technique he called the traveling split screen. A conventional split screen is pretty straightforward, right? It's like if you had an actor talking to himself and the actor is playing the same character, you first photograph the actor on one side of the screen, rewind the film, put a matte box, shoot the actor again on the other side of the screen. And you have to keep the actor on one side or on the other. They can't cross over. What Linwood Dunn designed on the optical printer for shots in Citizen Kane is called the traveling split screen, which means that that split screen could move during the shot. And because it could move, you could then go from previously photographed footage onto miniatures or matte paintings, and then sometimes back onto live action footage. So in the case of the Thatcher statue, they didn't have the statue. They just had the base of the statue when they were photographing it on the set. And Wells came to Linwood Dunn and said, I want to be up on the statue. He didn't understand technically how to do it, but he knew he could tell Dunn, can you do the shot for me? Can you figure out a way to enhance the scope of this movie so that I can see a statue of Thatcher, tilt off of that, and then into the scene?
The directors of the Thatcher Memorial Library have asked me to remind you again, Mr. Thompson, of the conditions under which you may inspect certain portions of Mr. Thatcher's unpublished memoirs. Yes, Jennings.
At the very beginning, when the reporters are watching the newsreel and they begin to discuss what is Rosebud, they're in this projection room. It's got a roominess to it. The voices are kind of off mic, as they would be if you were really hearing the voices in a spot like that. I noticed that right away when I first saw the film. I thought, boy, this seems real, like maybe these are real reporters in a real place. because it sounded correct. Like that's how it would sound if you really went out and went to such a spot. Another good example of reverberation is in Xanadu at the end of the movie, where Susan and KANE are alone in their gigantic castle, their palace.
Jigsaw puzzles?
To punctuate and to color in the fact that they are isolated, their voices are very echoey. You feel the slap of voices off the stone of this tomb that they're living in, practically. It's a very effective choice of how to treat those voices.
A really great example of the photographic style that Toland and Wells came up with is the interior of the boarding house with Kane's mother. It's an example, again, of this ensemble approach to the film. The camera is pulling back on a dolly. Ultimately, the characters are pretending that the table is there because the camera is there. So the table can't be there because the camera has to pull back through that area. And if you look really closely, you can see the hat kind of shaking a little bit because they had pushed the table in just at the right moment so it was there to be seen at the end of the shot. You see everything in focus from the foreground out into the distance, creating this sort of universal image that allows you to enjoy it and observe it and decide what characters you want to look at while they're performing.
I would imagine that Wells had multiple microphones placed in certain scenes so that you could play with the sound and the perspective of it at later time in the mix.
Be careful, Charles.
Kane.
Pull your muffler around your neck, Charles.
Kane, I think we shall have to tell him now.
Yes.
When you have the sledding scene and we're first out with the boy in the snow and you're hearing the cold sort of wind that's in the scene, and as it pulls back now to get into the conversation, the voices in the background drift away into a very distant sound. Wells being so oriented toward radio, where they would rehearse actor placement to the microphone. And where is the mic? Very specific kinds of choreography in the radio studio. And he translated that process onto the set, that there's many scenes in the movie where people are in different levels and distances in the scene.
Bernstein, these men who are now with the Inquirer, who were with the Article until yesterday.
When he's campaigning, he has this big party for everyone. Wells is dancing, and he's shouting out lines of dialogue from where he is to the people in the foreground. He directed the actors when they're in the foreground, they're shouting their lines. Even though they're talking to each other at a party table, it becomes very effective in the final movie once it's mixed that you get the idea that this is a chaotic party because of all the racket and the fact that two characters having a one-on-one conversation are shouting at each other or speaking loudly in order to be heard over the thing. It takes thinking ahead of time to do that in the stage of directing.
In the News on the March sequence, there is a fun shot of Xanadu being constructed. They wanted to show that the place had some history, So this was like a stock shot that they got from some library. So it's going to appear scratched up and used. And that's going to be part of the gag to make it look like it's something that was appropriate for this montage sequence. The way they achieved the shot was to shoot a matte painting of Xanadu under construction and then add that to a miniature of dump trucks and earth movers that were animated through the process of stop-motion animation. And that whole thing then is then rear projected behind a character in the foreground, a construction worker, and cranes to finish off the composite. And then it's scratched up to make it look like it's a piece of stock footage. In the case of the Opera House with Susan Alexander Kane on the stage, and the camera lifts off her, goes up into the flies, when they originally photographed the scene, it didn't have as much scope as what ended up in the picture. The shot only went from Susan Alexander Kane on stage up a little bit to the two men on the catwalk. That distance wasn't far enough. Wells came to Dunn and said, I want you to feel like the camera is raising way, way up into the flies before we get to the men on the catwalk. Linwood Dunn, with his traveling split screen technique, found a way to transition from the existing live action find an edge of a curtain, and then transition to a miniature of different backings and different parts of the set, things that you would expect to see backstage, traveling up, and then transitioning again back into the live action of the characters on the catwalk, really expanding that scope so that you could get this perspective of movement to make a much more dramatic scene than what they could afford to shoot on the set during production.
As you go up, her singing gets more and more distant and echoey. The sound is helping you along. And once again, it's not just there for showing off what you do with sound. It's there for a dramatic purpose. It creates geography. It creates a place and a relationship.
And creating this idea of Xanadu as this huge mansion needed visual effects to make this work. You couldn't build everything and make it practical. So they did build a wonderful staircase, which they called the Great Hall, and it had multi-levels. But they also added matte paintings to fill out those scenes to give it even more production value. And there's one shot in particular which I love that shows the live action of the part of the scene, which is really just like a quarter of the frame is what they photographed. Characters standing around crates, and then in the distance, the staircase. To that, they added a matte painting to fill out the scene. They added more boxes and candelabras and empty chairs on the left side of the frame. And then they put in stained glass windows, arches. I love these shots because they just go by very quickly and they expand the scope of the movie, but they're not really drawing a lot of attention to themselves. They're just there to help you establish this amazing interior space. Incidentally, I worked on Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Spielberg asked us to look at that last sequence in Citizen Kane. And if you notice, the way that the boxes are painted in that scene is very similar to what we did in the warehouse sequence at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
There's a great montage done in the film to give you, through sound, the descent of Susan's opera career. It's underscored with dissonant music. It's unpleasant to listen to. It's a gathering storm. And that would work if you didn't even see the picture of what was going on. If you just listened to that section of that, you would get that impression. And then finally, at the end, they have a light going off, kind of a filament that burns out, which is showing the not only the light gets extinguished, but her career is being extinguished as well.
One of my favorite shots in the beginning of the film is with the snow globe. You know, when Kane dies and drops the snow globe and it breaks on the ground, there's this beautiful shot of the snow globe house on the side and the reflection of the nurse coming into the scene. So they shot the snow globe practically on the set, but to try to get the distorted reflection of the nurse entering the room would have been too complicated. So Linwood Dunn on the optical printer combined that little piece of film of just a nurse opening the door into the snow globe so it looks like she is reflected in that scene.
Is there anything...
No thanks, Mr. Bernstein.
One other visual aspect of Citizen Kane that is so interesting is this idea of keeping the camera low and shooting the ceiling. Now, in most movies of the time, they never did this. They would shoot an establishing shot of the set, and there would be lights up on the ceiling. And then they would use a matte painting to matte out those lights. And that would be the establishing shot. So you would never see the ceiling, a low angle, because they never built the ceiling on conventional sets. Wells and Toland wanted to change that and have this sort of visual narrative. When the camera's low, looking up at a character, it's giving him prominence and importance. That was, again, part of the visual style that they wanted to convey in the film. The sets were made with muslin over the top, which is painted so that the microphones could be above the ceiling, but they were transparent and porous enough that they could still record sound. But again, that's just another example of a different approach to the visual style that they used in the film.
love.
KANE decides to throw a party to liven things up because they're trapped at Xanadu with no life left. During the party, they get into an argument. And as that's happening, you're hearing off-screen sound of a woman. She's in distress of some sort. The woman is finally screaming, and there's a slap. Everything comes to a halt except the screaming woman. It's the conscience of what's going on in Susan's mind. Once again, very much like radio. That's an unusual idea. I don't know of too many cases I can think of where that was done in Hollywood at the time. You know, they're thinking that in that way.
Me? I'm chairman of the board. I got nothing but time. What do you want to know?
Well, Mr. Bernstein, we thought maybe if we could find out what he meant by his last words as he was dying.
Citizen Kane, you may listen to it nowadays and not be startled by the sound in it or conscious of the techniques and how they're used or that they maybe came from radio. Those things got adapted into film and television to the extent that they no longer stand out when you watch Citizen Kane. You just think, oh, well, it's a good movie and nice sound, but you're not thinking innovation at that point because the things in that movie have long since been absorbed and become common part of the language.
Any film that you make that tries to break the rules a bit or tell a story with a different technique or different narrative, you sort of compare it to Citizen Kane because that was such an effective example of when it worked so well to break those rules. And so it continues to be a source of inspiration. But I think any great film today that tries to do something a little different is going to be compared to Kane. And we're all better off for seeing movies when directors try to do something different. There's nothing obvious about Citizen Kane. 80 years later, we're still watching the film, and it has been said it is the film that has gotten the most amount of people interested in wanting to become filmmakers.